Good evening. My name is Shaquille Goodson, and I'm an interpreter for American Sign Language, ASL, and I'm doing my presentation on Thomas Hopkins Gualladet. What is education? Education is care that is used to cultivate the minds of the youth, to evaluate their hearts, and to give knowledge of science and art in order for them to conduct themselves in the real world. And that was by Laurent Clark when talking to Thomas Hopkins Gualladet when he asked, what is education at the Royal Institution for the Deaf in France? And that was from a book called Place of Their Own by John Vickery and Barry Crouch. Thomas Hopkins Gualladet was born December 10th, 1787. He was the oldest of 12 children. Now, according to this book called World of Knowing by Andy Russell, Thomas Gualladet always had a weakness, and he was always smaller than the other children. But the doctor did apprise Mr. Gualladet that if he kept a good diet, he would be okay. And Gualladet did just that. He would go and attend Yale University at 17 years old, and 2 years later, he will graduate with his master's degree. Gualladet didn't stop there. He will continue his education, and he will go to the Andover Theological Seminar, where he become a regional minister. Now, this all makes sense because Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, father's side, were great religious leaders, and his mother's side were great civics and ambassadors. So I notice where Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet gets a lot of his strength, gets a lot of his willpower, and not only that, his skill of teaching the word of the Lord. When he came back home to Connecticut, he met a young lady named Alice Cogswell. Now, Alice Cogswell was deaf from a sickness that she had. And being the good Christian man Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet was, he wanted to figure out a way how to mediate the two languages of hearing and her being deaf. So he did a good job at teaching her how to spell, but he just couldn't really get her to read yet. So Alice Cogswell's father, who had money with Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, came up with a plan to send him to the Brentwood School for the Deaf in Europe in 1815. Now, during his experience at the Brentwood School for the Deaf, he felt uneasy. He didn't feel like, they would really have the ethics and morals that he had, because they were just all about making money. They did not want him to leave there and teach what he knew. They wanted to keep everything private, and he just wasn't feeling that. But the Lord will answer his prayers, and he will meet his future French colleagues, which the leader of the Royal Institution of the Deaf named Abbe Sicard. Now, with Abbe Sicard was two of his proteges. One was John Massou and Laurent Clark, and Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet and Laurent Clark will become very good friends. So Abbe Sicard told him that, hey, you can learn sign language with us, and gave him a free ticket to the Royal Institution for the Deaf in France. Now, during his stay there, he did write Miss Alice Cogswell how, he's ready to teach her what he's learned, and, he likes it there. Now, according to Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet in the book Place of Their Own by John Vickery and Barry Crouch, it was a French deaf man who wanted to come back to the States with him. But also from the University of Gualladet, it states that Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet ran out of money, and it was time for him to go home. Now, during this time, when he came back to the States, they went to New York. So they went to New York. They did a lot of networking, and prior to them coming to New York, Laurent Clark actually brought a published sign language hand-shaped signs for the alphabet that was published by Pablo Bonnet, and he actually bought that with him when he came to the States. So when he got to New York, they were networking, and they will eventually create a school called the New York Institution for the Deaf. Now they had a few people who joined, and it became sort of a small success. Eventually, it will become bigger than what it is. But they did that. But also during a lot of their networking and traveling, they raised enough money. They raised $5,000 in order for them to start the Connecticut School for the Deaf in Connecticut. So that's where he will go back home and he will meet Alice Cogswell and teach her everything that he knows. So during this time, they raised enough money, and they also got another additional 5,000 from the Connecticut schools, which was great, which they was happy for. So Alice Cogswell will become his first student, and then they had a sixth student named John Brewster, who was 51 years old. He was deaf. And during that time, it was called the American Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb. And that didn't sound right. Eventually, it will go on to become the American School for the Deaf. Now, during this time, this presentation was to show you how American Sign Language came to the United States. It was from the help from Abby Sicard and Laurent Clark, and especially Laurent Clark teaming up with Thomas Hopkins Gualladet and coming to the United States of America. And ASL root is the French Sign Language, because we got our hand shape, our ASL alphabet is kind of similar to the French Sign Language, because that's where it came from, and that's where Thomas Gallaudet learned sign language from. But ASL is pretty much a mixture of the English vocabulary and signs that the deaf community made up throughout the years, and made up the way it was spread, and how it got so prominent was teachers learning it from here and then traveling, as well as students learning it from here and traveling. And that's how we have American Sign Language today. Thank you.